Hello, welcome to Newin's Anime Review, a show where I review anime based on story, characters, animation, sound, and enjoyment, and give an overall rating based on a tiering system I have created. The review is intended to give you an idea whether this anime is the right anime for you or not, so please enjoy! It's been a long time coming. I really wanted to review this show, and do I have a lot to say about this arc. If you aren't familiar with my thoughts on the previous Sword Art Online arcs, I recommend you checking out my old reviews. My opinions still stand on them, and if you are curious of how I reviewed the previous seasons, do check it out. Let's get started with the story of Alicization, because this is the longest story arc for Sword Art Online so far. And to give a brief quick introduction and summary, probably wouldn't give you an idea of what's to come, because within this arc, there are multiple acts that could be separate stories which could be considered their own arcs. So let's start off with first act. The story basically begins right after the Gun Gale Online arc and the Ordinal Scale movie arc, for those who are not keeping up with the story. In the most simplest way to explain the setup, Kirito gets put into a coma, and to recover his consciousness, the company Wrath basically brings Kirito in and links up his consciousness with the world they have created called the Underworld. Basically, using this technology, they hope to bring his consciousness back to his body. But that is just really a basic story, because the Underworld has another focus. The company Wrath is actually trying to create an AI that can think for itself and behave according to their own emotions. Basically, what they're trying to create is an artificial human, and Kirito was actually hired by the company to test their AIs before he went to the coma. And before we can continue this further, these AIs are called Floodlight. This is what the SAO world refers to them as. He is basically testing the Floodlights in that world to see if they can break from their code and make their decisions on their own. And some of the Floodlights do break their own codes and start doing what they choose to do. And that is basically the key development points for some certain characters. Yu-Gi-Oh and Alice, who are two of the Floodlights created in the Underworld, are two friends Kirito makes in this world, and his influences helps them make their own decisions as the story progresses. That is the basic setup for Alicization story, but this is a long story. The first act of Alicization has Kirito and Yu-Gi-Oh going on an adventure to rescue Alice. Alice is the first Floodlight to break code, and therefore she was sent to the cathedral to be watched by the administrator, as she could be a threat to their world. So that is the first act of the story. I find this part of the story to be the most boring and convoluted plot Sword Art has come up with. There were many moments and episodes where the characters are just stuck in exposition. There is a lot of backtracking and characters trying to get the plot point out, and this was a huge problem I had during this act. There were many times I got really bored of the story and characters because I couldn't care for what was happening on screen. Also, at this point in the story, it was kind of hard to take anything seriously, because the problem I personally find with the Underworld concept is that all these characters, other than Kirito, are just AIs. So I couldn't take any character development seriously, knowing these aren't really people, and the fact that they're just running under the program. But that is probably why characters like Yu-Gi-Oh make the story a bit more interesting, because he is one of the characters we follow a bit that breaks his code early in the story, so we get to see in this world what happens when characters break from their program. But other than Yu-Gi-Oh and Alice, later on during the first act, every other character is really one-dimensional and uninteresting. None of the characters Kirito and Yu-Gi-Oh face off against are really characters that are deeply written. They are easily forgettable. The villains aren't that interesting, and their motivations just seem lacking. This also applies to the human characters as well. They are quite uninteresting as well, and when the story turns to them for a bit, it breaks the pacing and the flow of the overall story that's happening in the Underworld. And this brings us to Kirito, our MC of Sword Art Online. Kirito pretty much has little to no development during the first act of Alicization. He is pretty much the same character from the previous season with no significant changes to his personality. In fact, I think the story knows this and kind of puts him in the role of a supporting character for most of the time, and this brings us to the second act when he is reduced to a potato and has no character. In summary, the first act is quite a chore to watch as the characters aren't all that interesting, with the story pacing feeling very slow with a lot of exposition. It's the most boring part of the arc and the most tedious to sit through. However, things pick up during War of the Underworld act, the second act of Alicization. The second act of Alicization focuses more on Alice and the other characters, such as Asuna, more than Kirito. It's because Kirito is reduced to a potato state after what happened in the first act. I'm not going to go into too much detail of what happened, but it happened. The second act story focuses more on the terrorist organization invading the facility that is conducting the Underworld experiment in order to grab their hands on the AI technology. Basically, they want this technology to weaponize it. Pretty basic plot involving AI technology. And in order to gain this technology, they send their forces into the Underworld to retrieve Alice, who is a key component to their plans. And suddenly, there's a war in the Underworld. At this point, not to spoil anything, the story pretty much sticks on a straight path, battle between two factions and waiting for the return of Kirito to take down the final boss. I thought the Alicization story was probably one of the best story arcs for Sword Art Online. It had an interesting concept and premise, dealing with a very close to human AIs and their relationship to the outside world, and having those AIs learn they are not from the real world but from a man-made world made the story a bit more interesting. However, even though the premise is interesting, it doesn't help that the characters were boring and uninspiring. Apart from Yujo, who had his moments and I thought had the best character development out of the cast, his potential was not fully recognized. Not only did Yujo have an interesting story, but the story of his code breaking was much more interesting than Alice, because it played a part of how Kirito is developed. But like I said, Yujo had an interesting origin and build up, but his potential wasn't fully realized. My biggest problem was Alice, who was the heroine of the arc, and she's probably one of the least interesting female protagonists of Sword Art Online. An AI that basically broke the code first only for her to start following orders and defect is a pretty basic and unoriginal development. And even in the end, she just becomes another girl to fall into Kirito's harem. And compared to the previous female protagonist Shinon, who not only developed a lot, but held her own and established her own independence, she is not all that interesting. Alice's character and personality is just so bland during Alicization, and for their finale as well. And this is not only applied to Alice. A lot of the side characters that they introduce in the world aren't all that interesting as well. They either just feel tropes or just have boring personalities and uninteresting motives. And the fact that we all know that these are AIs, I could not care for whatever happened to these characters. They made it look like the stakes were high, but in reality, it's not really that high. When certain characters died or had their triumph, I could not care for the result because these characters were so uninspired and uninteresting. Like, this story maybe have been good if it was human characters, but the fact that the majority of characters are just AIs, you can't really sympathize with human emotions properly with them. And the villains in this arc? Okay. The first villain during this first half was more interesting than the second villain because it was basically what happens when an AI goes rogue. So it shows that there was a fault with this technology and kinda shows the potential of a more self-aware character. However, your second half villain just becomes another standard run-of-the-mill antagonist that goes power crazy and hungry Sword Art Online villain. Their motivation seems dumb and honestly, they just weren't good villains. Other than Yu-Gi-Oh and for a small handful of Kirito moments, no other main characters developed or were all that interesting. Kirito is pretty much the same as he's always been except for one small part during the second half when he was trying to discover himself. And I like that because it finally tackled the PTSD Kirito gained all the way back from the Ironclad arc. But for the majority of Alicization, it was pretty much the same. And this goes for Asuna, Leafa, and heck, they did my girl dirty, Shinon. All these returning characters pretty much had no development and were the same by the end of it all. Apart from the majority of characters being so boring, the pacing was pretty bad as well. The first half was just a slow burn. It was hard to sit through the many exposition this show had. I could not count the number of times I literally fell asleep while watching this show, that I had to backtrack so many times to make sure I didn't miss anything. I felt that the first half dragged on for too long, but it did develop Yu-Gi-Oh pretty well. However, the second half was the opposite of the first half, as if it was pretty much non-stop action from there, making it maybe too fast-paced. With so many characters for them to showcase, I'm not surprised that there's so many of these characters were uninteresting, because there was very little character development during the second half, and it was just action only, basically. The story had an interesting concept, but it had a lot of problems. If there is one thing I can never really fault Sword Art Online for, is their animation department. Say all the bad things you want to say about Sword Art Online, but if there's one consistent that is a positive for this series, it's the animation. And as always, it looks really good. Every action scene is done at such a high quality. It's very fluid and smooth and gorgeous looking. The use of the highlights and colors make every scene look damn amazing. Outside of these action scenes, this show looks very much like its movie counterpart. The art style may have not changed all that much in season 1, but that's understandable. It's nothing special, however, it looks clean. And that is all you really need for this series. Characters are recognizable, majority have unique designs, even though I would say pretty much all their eyes look the same, but it doesn't really stop this anime from looking smooth and polished. I can't say too much about the soundtrack as they pretty much have used the same soundtrack multiple times from the previous seasons, and your opinions wouldn't change all that much depending on how you felt about the original soundtrack. There's not really any memorable new soundtracks that I can think of. It's pretty good, but nothing special. It does the job and fits each scene well. Animas by Lisa and Animana by Riona are a banger of openings. They are powerful and set up the show very well, getting you hyped to watch. However, the other two are rather forgettable. The EDs are also forgettable except for Unlasting, which will send you chills at the end of each episode that is played. I would say there isn't really any noticeable performance by any voice actor, as majority of these characters don't really give you a lot of room to showcase anything special. This review has been a long time coming. I had to think a lot for how I want to review this, because I generally am one of the few who doesn't think Sword Art Online is a bad show. I don't think it's a great show either, but it's still a good, serviceable, enjoyable show to watch. Alicization, however, for me, even though it does have the most interesting premise and story out of Sword Art Online story, I couldn't enjoy it as much as any other arcs like Ironclad or Gun Gear Online arc. Because not only the developments in those arcs were good, but the characters were so much more interesting and likable in those arcs. For Alicization, I couldn't really invest into any of the characters and I didn't give a care for too much of them. The fight scenes were great, but because of the characters being uninspiring, a lot of action left out the emotions you would normally feel from a fight. It's a shame. I really wanted to like Alicization. I thought this arc was going to be the arc where a lot of people who were put off by Sword Art Online to change their minds, and it might for some people. But for me, it made my opinion of the series worse. I generally don't really like where the story could be going for the future, and this arc had too many parts where it was boring as hell, especially during the first arc. I feel like at this point, Sword Art Online has definitely lost its original touch. I personally like Sword Art Online when they focus on the game aspects of their world, but we have pretty much strayed away from that. I remember saying a reason you love Sword Art Online is because how easy it would be to self-insert yourself, especially if you were a gamer, which I'm assuming most people watching Sword Art Online are. As much as I think the production quality is amazing, the animation, the sound, it was really good, and the story premise was very interesting, it was the pacing and uninteresting characters that really brought down this arc for me. I previously gave Sword Art Online Season 1 and 2 a score of 7.5 and 7 respectively, which I would put in the high C tier or low B tier category of anime. However, for Alicization arc alone, I can't put this any higher than a C tier anime. The production quality is off the charts. It doesn't look like a C tier anime, but the story and characters had so many problems, I just had lost so much enjoyment from watching this arc. Because I actually enjoyed watching a lot of the previous seasons of Sword Art Online, and this arc just didn't do it for me. And it's just disappointing, because the story had so much potential, only for it to be so poorly executed with bad pacing and uninteresting characters. I hope you enjoyed this edition of Newin's anime review, and tune in for the next anime review. Please give this video a thumbs up if you want and subscribe to my channel. Keep watching and enjoy anime, watch what you want, and sayonara!